I wanted to talk today about a subject that I had intended to talk about several weeks ago. In fact, I preached the sermon in Ann Arbor several weeks ago, and for one reason and another, I've had to postpone preaching it here in the West Church since then. But I want to talk about primarily the responsibility that we have, one specific responsibility that we have as Christians, that is a God-plane responsibility. The primary function that God is involved in is that of being a father, that of being a parent, that of creating and rearing a family, correcting, teaching, instructing, and building within that family individuals who, as they come of age, and for us spiritually come of age means at the time of Jesus Christ's return or our death, whichever happens to come first, that we are born into the family of God. Within the physical lives that we lead, there is probably nothing in relationship to what we do as individuals physically that compares exactly to God's responsibility as being a parent. Being a parent is probably one of the most enjoyable and at the same time one of the most frustrating things that any of us ever go through. When you sit down and talk to individuals who are parents and listen to the stories that they tell, it's always remarkable to hear how things get more difficult as the children get older. You would think that it should become simpler, but it gets more and more complicated, it appears. When you talk to parents of young children that have kids that are maybe anywhere from brand new to 4 or 5 years old, they think they have a terrible time. And then when you talk to them that have the kids going into puberty and just into the early years of teenage, you think, boy, they have got an absolutely terrible time. Then when you listen to them and the kids are 17 and 18 years old and they're about ready to leave home, you think the parents are going to pull their hair out. And then by the time they've gone to college, you think, and parents are just absolutely going mad at what's going on in college and all of the aspects of what's there. And then all of a sudden it comes a time for them to get married. And then the parents are all up in arms again. And then they're married and you think, well, it's finally over. And then they call you up on the phone and say, hey, Mom, Dad, can you help me out here? Need a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of something else. And it goes on for a lifetime. And when you think about it in comparison to a spiritual point of view, as far as God's dealing with us, you realize that that's exactly the way it is with God spiritually, as a parent and as a father. That from the time He calls us, prior to the time that we even know about our birth or our even being considered at this time for a part of His family, He begins working with and dealing with our lives. It's exactly the same thing that is true for us. What we are as human beings was formed by the joining of a sperm and an egg unknown at the time that it happened to either mother or father. They were unaware that life was being created. They were totally unaware that anything was happening in relationship to the formation of life itself. Even if you're planning a child and you're trying to have it, you are not going to know the instant that that life begins. But from that very instant on, that human life is affected. The genetic structure and the makeup of that child is determined. The multiplication of those cells are one of the most rapid things that takes place within the human body. The looks of that child have already been determined by the joining of those two cells together, and that life has begun to be affected by parents who don't even know it's there yet, and may not know for certain for anywhere up to 8 to 10 weeks, after conception itself has actually taken place. But that child is being influenced from that time on. The same thing is true with God and us. That He begins influencing our minds, changing and shaping what we are, and eventually bringing us to a point of birth into His family. Now, in a Christian comparison, we're in a gestation state the entire time. We're in a state of begettal and growth to birth. From a physical point of view, the whole structure changes. What happens in a home and in a family when a woman becomes pregnant, and then finally a birth takes place and a child is born, is that everything is rearranged. And that's the way it should be in reality. And when you stop and examine what's there, you recognize that the influence of what being a parent is very much akin to what it is that God is doing with us from a spiritual point of view. And there is no other relationship between ours and God's in type that is exactly as perfect as that of being a parent and a father or a mother in dealing with children. So what I want to look at this afternoon are some of the principles biblically as far as child rearing is concerned that we must understand and examine. It's always fascinating when you start to talk about child rearing and consider what's involved in it, because it causes a mixed reaction amongst the people that are in the church. There are many of you here who don't have children at home anymore that you worry about. And so the subject of child rearing is not all that interesting and not all that vital to you. There are many of you that are here that have children who consider already that the structure of your child rearing is well beyond the need of anyone else to help you with. There are others of you here in relationship to looking at your children who would think, oh, please, take the kids, I don't want them, because I simply can't do anything at all with them, and maybe you can, and that would just be peachy. There's a whole realm of listeners that are involved. There are those that aren't even married at all yet, that are single or perhaps are considering marriage, and the subject of child rearing to them is not all that vital, and it's really too bad. It's one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, that the subject itself and the act of being a parent and a father gives so much understanding, insight, knowledge into, and views toward how God functions and the capacities that God actually uses in dealing with us as Christians, be you a father or a mother. In the case of child rearing, it makes very little difference, because from the child's point of view, you are both seen in the seat or in the responsibility of God as far as the child is concerned. There are a couple of things that I want to look at particularly in relationship to it, and then go through a number of specifics that are there, and look at it primarily from a biblical point of view. It's not my intent to go through it from a psychologist's point of view or from a counselor's point of view, but from a biblical perspective on what child rearing principles actually function and which ones work. Because the use of them produces the kind of results that you would like. The lack of knowledge of how to apply them produces chaos and oftentimes a lot of unpleasant experiences within a family itself. One thing that has to be understood, too, from the very beginning, when you talk about the subject of children, you have to understand that just as Christians, just as you and I are Christians, and you hear the sound of my voice and the words that come out of God's Bible, and you understand and perceive them, you decide what ultimately you will do with that knowledge and information. Please understand that that's true with children as well. I've seen it happen on a multitude, I won't say a multitude, but on many occasions, where the parents have tried and have applied and used the principles and done all of the things there, and a child has gone off and done the type of thing that you could never imagine having come out of that home. I've seen it happen, and I know that it does. It doesn't mean that if you do these things correctly, you can guarantee that by the time your child is 16, 17, 18, or 19 years old, that he's going to be a model citizen. That's not the case at all. But what it does do is it does give you a basis from which to work and a principle from which to operate on, that if you're going to get fruit of value from it, you'll get it from these principles and from this format. First thing that we need to cover as far as child rearing is concerned, and the thing that needs to be understood more than anything else, and the most important factor that is involved within rearing of children, is the relationship that exists between mom and dad. The marriage itself is the most important aspect. Now, when you look at it from the principle of the biblical example and you consider it for just a little while from that point of view, it's very simple to see and understand why. In the Bible, marriage is described as a type of the relationship between Jesus Christ and the church. In the home situation, the marriage relationship is exactly the same in the eyes of a child. And if that relationship is bad, then you can bet on the fact that almost any other factor involved will be distorted in its influence on a child. The marriage relationship between a husband and a wife is going to be reflected in their children, in what they see and how they act and in what they do. The principle that's involved in that we find in the first book of John, and we want to take a look at it just briefly because I want to dwell on this before we get into how many times should I spank him at all, how should I do this and what should I do that. Before we get to that point, we need to understand that what children are going to learn most by is what they see, what they perceive and understand, and what they know because they watch it happen. No amount of words will erase or change that. Nothing that you do will erase or change it unless you modify or correct the problems that exist between husbands and wives, if they are there, and work on establishing before the children a genuine relationship that reflects love and security and attachment one to the other, so that there is nothing in their minds that would distort nor take away from that, nor leave them in a state of not really being able to perceive what they ought to see in such a relationship that would give them the security they need. 1 John, the 4th chapter, John talks about the functioning here of how love works, and he's describing love here from the format of God's love, what the Greek would call agape love, the kind of love that is unselfish, that is unconcerned for getting for itself, but is concerned for providing for the other. And here he gives us an important point that's involved for us. It's been involved in our lives spiritually as Christians, and it's involved with children. And they need to perceive and understand and be able to see this. In verse 19, it says, we love. 1 John 4 and verse 19, we love because he first loved us. In our relationship to God, God dealt with us from his point of view and calling and intent and purpose first, before we were ever able to turn around and appreciate who he was, what he had done, and how it affected our lives and what it opened up to our future. That same thing is true with children, and as parents within that, you must deal as God does with your children the same way that he does with us. In that you must first make sure that they see that love, that it exists between you and your husband, that it exists in the relationship that you establish from the time they're conscious enough to understand between them and you. Love is defined in a multitude of ways from a biblical point of view, but the point that is involved here is that both as parents must be involved in the life of that child. In the very same way that from a spiritual point of view, both as parents are involved in your lives. God is the one who calls and deals with you as an individual, and it is through him that you will eventually be a part of God's family itself. But the church is the mother of us all. And it's through the church that the instruction comes from the sound of a voice, from the information that comes here on the Sabbath, or through the Bible studies, or any of the other ways that it works. Both are involved with the lives of the people that are there. Both are involved with trying to point those lives in a direction that's going to succeed as far as God's kingdom is concerned. Such is the same thing with children. And oftentimes one of the biggest problems that exists within child-rearing difficulties is a lack of involvement of either one or both, and most frequently of a father. Almost inevitably, he's the most difficult one to have involved within rearing children. Ironic that it should be that way, because from God's point of view, that is his responsibility. That's exactly what we call him when we pray. Jesus Christ said, when you pray to your Father, you say, Our Father, which is in heaven, in the example that he gave. In relationship to our own children, the influence of time and effort and energy has to be reflected as at least as much by a father, if not more, even than a mother, in the involvement of what the children are going to grow up and develop like and what their attitude will be like. It's an important area. In fact, I consider that it is the most critical area within the framework of rearing children. And that if you're going to get out of your children what you would like to have, and you're going to have from your children responsiveness and openness, a willingness to see and learn and hear and perceive a value within themselves as to what their lives are worth and what it is that they will accomplish, that ingredient of the marriage itself must exist. It is the primary thing that's there. One of the worst problems that exists within our society today are people that go out and have themselves a great time in bed, and the girl comes away pregnant. And the solutions in our day and age now are almost unbelievable. Solutions that come up with, well, let's have an abortion. It's quite simple in our society now. That's the simplest way to eliminate life. We'll just commit the murder before the child is born. The other solution is that when the child is born, you just simply leave it. Down in Houston, not too long ago, they left a little baby. A woman had one, left the child, deposited it in the manger scene out in front of a church, and left the child. I think it was in Houston. And they named the child Timothy Christmas, as they have no idea who his mother or father is. It's a solution to the problem. You know, she was in bed for whatever reasons, ended up pregnant, and she certainly didn't want to be. Apparently didn't have the courage or did not want to have an abortion, and simply abandoned the child. Many of them are simply killed, are left and are killed, just abandoned and left. In our society, there are other solutions as well, and then you can sit down and talk to the kids who've gone through that. Many of you who are sitting here, some of you who are orphans, don't know who your parents were adopted out at the time you were too young to even understand or to know. And the law in our land even prevents you from finding out, and in many cases it's probably just as well that the law does do that. You sit down and talk to somebody who reaches the age of 15 or 16 or 17 years old, understands that they're adopted, maybe loves their adopted parents, but who is totally unable to know who his mother or his father is. You think there isn't a pain that's attached to that? You think there isn't a lot of grief about wondering, why didn't they love me? Why didn't they want me? Why weren't they interested in what I am and what I do and what my life has become? Why don't they want to know? Why didn't they care then? It's a pretty hard thing for individuals to live with and to deal with themselves. In our society, there ought to be a law against a lot of things, many of them involving sex itself and the disruptions that it creates within the society, and certainly to the children that are born and then abandoned in relationship to it. Within our framework of dealing with a family, though, as Christians, it is essential that both parents are involved with the children, that both parents are involved in teaching, in instructing, in giving time, in spending time, in playing, and in working with those kids. If they're going to develop the kind of attitude that you would like to see reflected, they must see it between you and your wife, or you and your husband, and then coming toward them from both of you, as far as their value or their worth is concerned. And if you're experiencing problems there, and within the marriage itself, those problems are reflected to the kids. How many of you, when you were kids, heard your parents argue? What did you want to do? Hey, what did you want to do when you heard them argue, especially when you were little? What you wanted to do was go find some place to hide, because the immediate reaction that came out was, Mommy doesn't like Daddy, or Daddy doesn't like Mommy. And it scares a child. It frightens them and worries them. Happens periodically to all of us. We sit down and get into a discussion or an argument about something where it is not all that important oftentimes, but nevertheless, where it comes up. I'll tell you what happens to my kids. They sit down and look, if I'm upset, or if Amy's upset, or if she cries, or I sit there and look like, boy, there's something wrong. The kid looks at me and says, don't be sad, Mommy. Don't be unhappy. The worst thing in the world that you can do is create that attitude of insecurity within a child's mind. A lot of us do it very frequently within our children's minds, and don't even stop to think about what the ramifications and the results of it are later on. Within that framework, there is an area that has to be worked on very directly. And if it exists as a problem there, then if you have problems with your children, you better step back to the marriage relationship and work on correcting it, because that will be primary in solving the attitude problems that exists within the children themselves, if they do exist. It's not the only cause, and it's not always the cause. But if you know that to be part of it, then as Christians, you better work on correcting what's involved in it and taking the steps to do so for the sake of your children, as well as your own sake and your own happiness. Second area I want to mention before we get into some of the other basic principles that are there is that being a parent is a process of learning. It is not a process that you are taught. None of us ever are. Being a parent is something that you learn to do when you have the child and the responsibility. And you have to learn some principles that will work. Not all of the principles that I'm going to talk about today will work specifically for every one of you. A lot of them will vary as far as your own personality is concerned, but the principles are valid. How you learn to apply them in your own situation will be something that you will have to learn. Being a parent tests absolutely everything about your character and your nature. Absolutely everything. Because when you deal with a child and all of the things that a child represents, regardless of how old they are, whether they're 18 years of age and still living in your home before they go off to college or move out and leave, or they're just born, they interfere in your life. And it tests the very basic element in human nature, and that is selfishness. Because a child demands things of you and requires things from you. And those things that are required will test every bit of what your character is in every area. Your selfishness, your patience, your willingness to give time, to part with something that you want to do in order to provide it for them. Every single one of those things will be involved in your life. Anger. I'll tell you, I have sat down and looked at myself sometimes in relationship to my children and kids that I desired and wanted and all the rest, and yet I have been able to see in myself anger to a point that I very rarely get towards someone else that I would become upset at. To the point where I can get angry and could get to the point I could see in my own human nature where if I let it go, that I could end up doing damage physically to a child. It's a horrible thing to think about, and I've seen kids who've had that done to them. And I thank God for His Spirit and an understanding and knowledge of what it is. But I recognize that within human nature, a child will test a parent and that aspect of what you are just about as far as you can take it. And I think all of us, having had children and reared them, will understand and know how that works and exactly what it means. It is a process that takes years in the learning. And it's interesting to me that in the process itself, I don't think that it is all ever entirely learned. When you listen to the stories that are told by parents that are older, grandparents, when you stop and think back about the things that you did to your parents and the attitudes and the actions that you had, you realize that being a parent is a process that will go on as long as your children are alive. I get a lot of fun out of kidding my mother. My dad is dead and has been dead for 15 years. But I get a lot of fun out of kidding my mother because in the relationship that we have, she's in the church and I'm in the church, and as a minister, it causes a great deal of conflict in her mind. It causes conflict for one thing because she likes to come and ask me, what do I think about this or that, and then when I tell her, she takes a great deal of delight in disagreeing, sonny boy, because you just don't get it straight. And there is no way ever that within the physical framework of life you can outgrow the relationship of being a child as long as your parents are alive. Now, my mom is 67 years old, and as far as she's concerned, I'm just one of the little boys that were in the family, and I always will be. Now, for a while, I fought against that. I used to struggle against that. Now I simply accept it. Try to, anyhow, in the conversations that we have and in the areas where we disagree, because I've learned a long time ago, if I could do it, it would be good. I've learned it, but I don't practice it all the time. I've learned a long time ago that you can't correct your parents. It doesn't make any difference whether they're right or wrong. You cannot do it. There's no way that it can possibly work and function. It's a relationship that goes on throughout life itself, and it's a process of learning. It's a process really of learning a responsibility that God himself has from a spiritual point of view toward us as his children, as he's rearing us. It's a process that begins from the time the child is born, and you begin to be responsible for the needs that that individual has, whether it's food, diapers, whatever else it is that's involved all the way through the time that that child is going to live or that you are. You're going to be involved in that child's life and involved in teaching, training, rearing it, influencing it by your own example. What you do, say, and how you function is going to have a lifelong impact upon that child. Let's take a look at some of the basic guidelines that we have biblically, some of the principles that are here that need to be taught, assuming that the marriage relationship is functioning well, assuming that both the parents are willing to learn and are learning, whether they're willing to or not, they're learning about being parents one way or another. Here are the guidelines biblically that you ought to begin to apply and start to use, if you don't already, in relationship to your children. First of all, one of the things that needs to be taught within the child's mind, and needs to be established at a very young age within the child's mind, is a respect for his parents. Now let's go back all the way to the beginning, in one sense, to the Ten Commandments. And here we find contained within the Ten Commandments a commandment concerning mothers and fathers and the attitude of children toward them. The child is not going to know this. It's not innate knowledge. There is no innate knowledge within a human mind when it's born. All the knowledge that is there, as Mr. Armstrong has pointed out for so many years, comes through the five senses. It hears, sees, feels, touches, smells, tastes. Beyond that, anything else has to be put into the mind. From our point of view now, it's put in spiritually as well as through the five senses. God's Spirit gives us the chance to absorb. A child does not. And a child must be taught certain things that exist. And those things must be impressed in a child's mind. And one of the first things that has to be done and has to be understood is that a child needs to be taught to honor its parents, to respect its parents, to respect you and your husband, or your husband and you, whichever way you want to look at how it needs to be done. It needs to be established at a very young age within the child's mind. Exodus, the 20th chapter. And in verse 12, in the 5th commandment, it says, honor your father and your mother. Now, it's talking about honoring your parents here for those of us that are adult and able to understand it. But the law applies as well to children. Honor your father and your mother that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. As adults, it's necessary to do. That's why I try to learn not to correct my mother, even though she's wrong. I will step back and swallow very hard, and sometimes I succeed and other times I don't. And when I don't, I always get in trouble. And it doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong, I ought to be in trouble because I've stepped over the line that I should not have done. In any event, the point exists for children, that they ought to be taught from the very beginning a respect for their parents. And they ought to be taught it in a way that's proper, not out of a way that's demanding, but out of a way that's proper so that in their mind they can associate with you as a parent certain things that are to be respected. And those areas need to be explained very clearly. In fact, if you look in the Old Testament at the attitude that God gave from a civil point of view to the nation itself, it's almost frightening what happened when a child was not. Turn over with me to Deuteronomy, the 21st chapter. We don't advocate this today, but just for the sake of understanding how God dealt with delinquency. And this is exactly what it's describing. Deuteronomy 21, beginning in verse 17, or verse 18. There are a number of things here that we no longer apply in relationship to from a Christian point of view, but just in understanding how important the principle is when there was only a physical administration of the law in the Old Testament. Look how God told them within the city or within the nation of Israel to deal with delinquency. Verse 18, it says, "If any man has a stubborn and a rebellious son, who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even then listen to them." In other words, even when he's corrected, he will not hear. He shuts his mind off and refuses to yield to the authority that is there, that God has placed within the home. Then it says, "His father and his mother shall seize him." Not gingerly encourage him. I mean, they'll grab hold of him, both of them, take him. "Bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown," which is the area of judgment that's established as you read, "Take him to the gate of the city," is always where the elders sat and where judgment was passed in areas of this kind. "And they shall say to the elders of the city," in verse 20, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunk." Now, this is not a kid of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years old they're talking about here. This is a teenager, young man, the area of life where his own life is beginning and where he himself considers that what his decisions are were more important than what his parents decided on his behalf in relationship to how he dealt with them. He says, "Then the men of this city," it says in verse 21, "shall stone him to death." Child is to be understood very clearly. And from a parental point of view, that is something that must be done and must be taught to a child while he's young. One of the mistakes that is often made by parents, especially by mothers, and don't ask me why, but it's almost always by mothers that do it, is that they attempt to reason with children. They attempt for one point or the other to sit down and reason with the child rather than to correct him. Rather than to stop and say, "Okay, look, you're the kid, I'm the adult, it ain't going to be that way." But a mother, for some reason or another, will tend to sit down and go through an entire reasoning process and attempt to treat a child like an adult. I've seen mothers try to do that with kids that are 2 and 3 years old. And I'm absolutely amazed. "Johnny, won't you please sit down?" Because that's the polite thing to do. "Sit down, Johnny. Now, please sit down." Because that's what you should do. You should sit down and be quiet. And they will sit and carry on a discussion with the child about what he should and should not do. If that's the case, you have totally missed the point in relationship to what exists between parent and child. Turn over with me, if you will, to Proverbs, and let's take a look at a couple of the Proverbs that apply to this particular point that's involved as far as parental relationship and respect and how you ought to treat the child. A child is a child. And you need to understand there is not maturity there, and there is not capacity at the time a child is anywhere from born through the age of, I'd say, 12 years old, before you begin to sit down and start to reason with him. Now, my son David is going to be 10 here in a couple of months. And it comes to the point now where there are certain things that I can sit down and discuss with him, the right and the wrong. There are certain times when I can sit down and take the subject with him and go through it and rationalize it out and have him come to the other end and see that's the way it is. But you know, there are times when I can't do that at all. There are times when I have no capacity. He has no capacity, and I have no capacity to teach him yet, and he's almost 10 now, to sit down and rationalize through every subject that's there. "Well, Daddy, why must I have to do this?" "Well, the reason is because that I told you. That's the reason right now, and that's all there is to it. But I don't understand." You don't have to understand. What you have to do is do it. And the sooner the better. And there is no discussion about it. And if it goes beyond that point, then the next sentence that comes out is, "David, go get me the paddle." In which case all reasoning tends to end. Everything is over from that point on because nobody in the house wants to go get the paddle. And he understands that reason very clearly. But there are times when, as a child, he is still a child. And he is not an adult. But there are other times now where I can see within his mind the opening of the questions and the capacity to start to think about and to want to ask and to talk about why. And when I can see that exist in his mind, then I want it to be developed. Because that very independence in him by the time he's another 8 years older is what I desire. I want him by the time that he's 8 years old to be independent. functioning on his own. I may not like what he does any more than a lot of you like what your teenagers do, but nevertheless, I want him at that age. But I want him there with certain purposes in mind, and we'll talk about that a little later on. Proverbs 22, and in verse 15. Foolishness, Solomon said, is bound up in the heart of the child. I'll give you an example. This morning we didn't go to the morning church, and so we were home this morning, and the kids were playing and doing one thing and another. And in the family room of the house, David was playing with Brucey and Becky. And they were playing a kind of pile-on game. I don't mind that. It's not too bad, especially if they're outside. But inside, they were playing the pile-on game where David had the blanket quilt over the top of his head, and he'd say, "Get on my back, Brucey," and climb on, and then he'd bounce him off, and then he'd tell Becky to do it. And he couldn't see where he was. And to him, it was just a lot of fun. And to the other two kids, it was just as much fun, but bound up in the whole bunch of them was a lot of foolishness. Because I watched him once, and he almost got Brucey into the television set. And before I could say anything, he almost got Becky into the fireplace. By that time, my mouth was open, and I said, "David," and he stopped because that tone of voice drops a little bit, and he understands that he better at least listen before he does anything else. And he looked out and didn't want to quit. "Well, we're not doing anything wrong." And I told him, I said, "Okay, here's why. You stop now before somebody gets hurt. Now, you've almost done it." So I reasoned with him and made him understand this is why and this is why. And fortunately for him, he responded to that. Because had he said, "But Dad," it would have been, "But whack." And then it would have been a very simple explanation. Kids don't think about what it is they do. And all the way through the time they're almost teenagers, you're still dealing with the fact that they are not fully mature and they are not yet adults. I talked not so long ago to a young lady who was 17 years old when she decided to get herself married. 17 years old. As a matter of fact, she decided who she was going to marry at 15. At 17, she married him, and now she's not living with him. In fact, she doesn't want to have anything to do with him. Because she realizes when she was 15, she wasn't smart enough to hear her parents. When she was 17, she wasn't smart enough to know what was right and wrong herself. And now that she's reached an age where she is, she realized she made all those decisions still as a child and did not have the competency yet of adulthood to understand how serious those decisions were. That goes on for quite a period of time, and it's why, particularly in relationship to marriage, we discourage marriage within the church between individuals until they pass the age of at least 20 or 21 years of age. And even then, might be a little early. But in our society, at least at that age, they've got a fighting chance to begin to survive. But teenagers, when they're in the frame of 15, 16, and 17 years old, it's very difficult for them to understand that in their own mind, it's still functioning as a child in part. Not totally, but in part. And it will continue to do that for a period of time until physically the individual completely matures. And in some cases, it takes a good long time. And in fact, for some people I know, they haven't made it yet, and they're in their 30s. And they're still trying to grow up in relationship to some of the things that they live and do. And I guess in one way that's true of almost all of us. The principle, though, has to be understood. That respect has to be taught to a child, and a child must understand that mommy and daddy are very important to them. And that the intent from your mother and your father to the child is to help and to direct and to lead you in a right way. And there must be a responsiveness that comes back from a child to learn that. Part of that, again, is going to be tied a great deal to example. One of the things that happens almost tragically within a family situation that will destroy the respect of a parent for or a child for a parent is that one or the other parent will demean or will say something that is demeaning to the other in front of the children. That they will make a comment, one to the other, that is a complete put-down, that is an insult, that says, "Well, isn't that a dumb thing to do?" Now, it might have been. It might have been. Your wife might have said to you, it was a dumb thing to do. And you know what? It might have been. But it was the wrong time to say it if the children were there. Or as you will often do, as sometimes I find myself doing, you make a comment that you don't want to say at all anyway, but you say when the kids aren't there. The kids aren't. Or that the mother or father isn't, and it's said, and then you say, that was the wrong thing to say. Because the kids will hear it, and their response will cause them to think less of mom or dad. Bad thing to do. And will undermine the entire principle that's involved in teaching the children respect for each other. With the children, it is absolutely necessary that you maintain and uphold the responsibilities one of the other. as mother and father, and that you do not allow it to be undermined by any of the activities that you take or that you allow to be done. Let's take a look at another point that's involved here, and I want to mention it again in relationship to the example I talked about at the very beginning between husband and wife, and that is that of time and love. Within the framework of rearing children, the most important aspect that is there is not so much the correction that comes and the discipline, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the thing that is important within the framework of the relationship that exists more than anything else is time and love. Within that framework, it is absolutely essential that you provide of yourself for your children. Now, we can't do what God does. God is available to us as a father anytime we'd like to talk to him. It doesn't require anything at all on our part. When we require God's time, all he asks of us is go find someplace private to do it. Or if you don't have time, wherever it is. You know, you're driving along in the car and all of a sudden you realize you're about to be in the midst of an accident, and out of your mouth comes, "Oh God, help me." He's there somehow or another. I mean, it just happens that he hears whatever way you'd like to say it. Now, as physical parents, we can't do that. We're separated physically by our children. We don't have the capacities that God has spiritually. And we're separated physically for hours at a time. Kids are in school and are under influences that are nowhere near what you would like them to be. They're separated because you're at work. They're separated in duration by hours of time. Happened to me when my son was very young. And I started correcting it as I got older and a little bit wiser about it, because it used to be in the morning. My habits were that I would get up with Amy before we had any children, and I'd take a couple of hours every morning, and I still do, but I do it differently now. And I'd pray and study and do the things of reading that I wanted to do. Then around 11 o'clock or 12, I'd jump in my car, and I'd be gone till 10 or 11 o'clock that night. And in the meantime, as we went along over the years, all of a sudden I had a son. And we had David for 4 years before Becky was born, and I began to realize that I never saw that kid. Because by the time I'd leave in the morning, I'd get up in the morning, he'd get up later on, usually when he was younger. I'd be in my office studying and working and whatever, and we would eat at different times because of his necessity to eat when he woke up, and I would have already eaten prior to that or later on. Then I'd leave and I wouldn't see him when I got home. And the kid was starting to grow up, and I wasn't even seeing him. And I began to recognize that I was not arranging my time to take care of my responsibility toward my child that I wanted. The children will make demands for the time, but they cannot make you give the time. You have to do that as a parent. You have to set aside the time, and you have to make available that time. There are many things within our society that take away from time itself. One of them is television. Television will eat up an enormous amount of time. And if you allow it to be used that way, you will eat up a lot of time that you could give to your children. And you need to find a way to enjoy time with your children. Sit down and play them games. Right now, David's to the point where he likes to play chess. Picked up a chess set down in Mexico while we were there, and he had learned before that, and he's just involved and loves to sit down and play chess. Now, for anybody that plays chess, it's not a whole heck of a lot of fun to play with a 10-year-old. Because if you play for a while and you learn some of the basic things that are involved in the game, it's not too difficult to beat him. He's getting better, though, I'll have to tell you. He's improved, and that's how he's going to do it. But, you know, he wants the time to sit down and play chess. And if I don't make the time to do it, it won't happen. If I don't take the time to sit down and play the game with him, there is no way he can make me do it. I have to give it. Becky's hung up right now on playing cards. Now, we'll sit down and play a game of chess with David, and the next thing I know, I got knocking on my knee. Here's a little girl that's got her deck of cards and wants to sit down and play crazy eights. You know, let's play crazy eights, Dad. Sit down and play a game of crazy eights. I'm stuck. And you have to do it. You have to give up something else in order to provide that time for your children. And they need the influence of you as a parent, be it mother or father. Sometimes it's more important to set aside things that you consider important to accomplish what the needs for the children are and what that time that is there for exists, and use it in a way that is proper, to prepare it and to use it, to set aside time specifically to do it, and to take them to accomplish something or take them to do something that you know that they want to do. Set aside the time and set aside the money in relationship to it. One of the things in our society that is not done as far as time is concerned, I've mentioned already, and that is the influence of dad. In our society, it's considered a woman's responsibility as far as rearing the children is concerned. Most women, by the time they have 2 or 3 young kids in home, all at the same time, go bananas. Day after day, they exist within the framework of the house and the 4 walls, and what they get to doing is talking to the kids. Gitchy, goo, goo, gaga. And by the time it's all done, even if the kid is 7 or 8 or 9 years old, she's still talking in elementary terms to another human being who's 7 or 8 or 9 years old, and I think it may be one of the reasons why women tend to reason with children, because they don't have the opportunity to reason with dad. So they reason with the kids instead, and they talk to the children instead of correcting the children, which is most necessary as far as most of the women are concerned, and where the biggest fault with them usually lies. Whereas dad, on the other hand, doesn't have the time to reason, and so what the kids get most of the time from him is correction. And it's really a shame, because it begins to reflect a very distorted relationship between mom and dad and the children. And the time actually has to be made, and dad has to help. One of the things that I suggest to almost all young couples and young families is that dad gives mom the day off, as far as the kids are concerned. Is that dear old dad takes the kids and stuffs them in the car maybe on Sunday morning and takes them off and goes somewhere with them and gives mom a break. Maybe mom takes the car and goes off to the mall and doesn't have to total along the 3 kids, and dad stays home and goes bananas by the end of the day. But the point is that there is an influence that is there by a father, and that a mother, especially a young woman, gets some time to herself. Get some time away from the family, away from the children, away from the responsibilities that are there. Now, within the framework of a family that's young, and within the framework of the church itself, there ought to be the ability to establish that. There ought to be the ability to accomplish that, and to make sure that it gets done. It takes a little bit of thought and a little bit of effort, but it can be accomplished if you'll work at it and understand the influence and the value of that time. One of the things that I think is important as far as children are concerned as well is that the influence does not become totally one-sided. Oftentimes, fathers spend less time with their daughters than they do with their sons. I think it's a shame that it happens that way. It happens in my family. And unless there's a conscious effort to make a change so that I spend time with my daughter and consider the need that she has for that, it just goes by me. And I don't stop to think about the fact that it ought to be done. It's necessary in a relationship that's there. One of the things that has to be understood by children in viewing a marriage as they look up at mommy and daddy is a discernment of who's what in the marriage. Regardless of the help that is given one way or another, there has to be a discernment in the marriage relationship itself between who's mom and who's dad, and how the kid looks up and tells the difference between who mom and who dad is. Now, in our society, there are traditional role responsibilities that are played there. It hasn't always been that way, but there are certain ones that have to be maintained, and that as a child looks up, he sees. One of the things I'm against, and have always been against, is dear old dad being a changer of diapers. Not only because I don't like diapers, but it's because to the kids, not the kid whose diaper is being changed, he's looking up going, he just feels better. He doesn't care who's doing it. It doesn't make any difference to him. But the other kids that are watching, who's carting the kid in and out all the time? Who's what's the deal is this? Is this a 50% deal on whose jobs these are? And little kids sit up and watch that, and they're not quite sure. The little girl looks up, and it's always dad that takes the kid out to diaper him, if that's the case, or whatever the circumstance is. And it's not the kid that it's being done to, it's the one that is sitting watching it do it. And that's where the problem of example within role relationships come about that have to be understood and discernible to a child. They have to be able to see that relationship and be able to properly establish an identity. Be you a girl or a boy, as the kid is growing, they have to be able to recognize what those things are. And in your relationship, you ought to make sure that that's the case. Now, when you only got one kid, it doesn't matter a whole lot. When you got 2 and they start to get up and watch, then you have to understand that kids hear and see a lot they don't say anything about. They watch it and they think it, but they say nothing about it until later on it just influences them and becomes a part of what they are. Psychologists, if their evaluations are correct, say that the personalities and the basic makeup of us as human beings are accomplished between 5 and 7 years of age. Depends upon who you read. They will say that it's somewhere in that range. As young as 5, maybe as late as 7. That the basic personality is shaped. I'm done with my son. The basic personality framework of what his life is has already been molded and established. He's past that age. My daughter, I might still have another year to work with and to influence, but I can already see formed within her very distinctive patterns of personality, and of attributes. My youngest one is only 4. So I've got anywhere from a year to 3 years still to influence and shape him, and even at his age, because of the influence of the older 2, he's already shaped in a certain way, and his habits and his nature has already been established. And there's going to be very little that will be accomplished. Those things are viewed by kids, and oftentimes they never say anything about it. It just goes in, it's absorbed, and that's the normal. And that normal then is what's going to be reflected later on as they become older, as they become parents, as they become functioning in the same roles. They're going to repeat those things that they have seen and consider to be normal. Okay, within that framework of time, there's one other thing I want to mention. And not only the television set, but also in relationship to children as far as how they spend time, are toys. Toys are something, again, in our society, and this time of year, if you have kids that watch television, they just advertise like bananas. You know, buy them racetracks, buy them this, buy them that, get them this. Our whole society is materialistically oriented in what its functioning is as far as children is concerned. One of the things that influences children are how and where they spend time. And as parents, oftentimes we buy children what they demand rather than what is valuable and good for them. What is going to lead and would be conducive to leading them to spend time in a fashion that's going to be helpful to them. One of the things that I won't have in the house and that I have not got as a toy and will not have within the home itself are toys that pertain to war or guns or cops and robbers or shoot 'em up. My kids don't play those games. Now, they do periodically. You know, they get out with the neighborhood kids, and I find out they're playing them. And as soon as I find out, I'll take them out of the game. I'll tell them, no, you cannot play that game. We don't have any toy guns. We have real guns. And I take my son out, and I've taken my littlest one out and go out skeet shooting with him. And all you got to do is pull the trigger of that thing while they're standing somewhere close by. And that's all. They don't want to hear that thing anymore. They don't want to see anything happen to it. Now, I want them to learn about it. And my son owns his own shotgun, a little 410. But I'll tell you what, it only took a couple times of shooting it before he realized it wasn't all that much of a kick. And I try and make certain that they understand a proper relationship to that, and as parents, you ought to make certain. Now, kids like to do it. I got a little guy here who's sound asleep, Bruce. Loves guns. Absolutely fascinated by guns. David has a collection of Lego that he's been building for years, and if I let Brucey loosen that for any period of time, you know what he'll build? A gun. If he gets a hold of a banana, you know what it is? A gun. It's unbelievable. I have to sit down with Bruce at 4 years old, sit down in front of him. I used to watch on Friday evenings, and I'd keep him up sometimes to see it, The World at War. I take the paper and sections of the paper that came out in the last couple of weeks here, if you've been watching any of the articles that have come out on Cambodia, and sit down with your children and show them what a gun does, what war does. Make them understand that that is not a toy. Now you sit and they turn on the television set, and what do we got on? You know, we got Starsky and Hutch or whoever the shoot-'em-up guys are these days. I'm not sure who it is. A variety of them that happen to be on that are all the heroes. They're all villains. It is the most idiotic part of the thing that's on television for kids that is. If you don't influence that time as a parent, if you don't limit that time, then you're allowing all of those values to be established in a child's mind. All of those values to be accepted unless they're balanced in one way or another. My dad was a policeman. And I watched all the things and I thought cops and robbers were fun too. But you know, one thing that I never ended up with is being fascinated by a gun because I was around them all the time. I saw a gun all the time. My dad, from the time that I was a kid, sat me down and we used to clean that gun. You know, he'd take that cannon out and put it out on the table along with a multitude of others he had, and we'd clean them out. But we also went downstairs in the basement to shoot him. And he also did the same thing as a cop, sitting down and showing me what a gun will do to a human being. Unbelievably disgusting when you see it. I went through with Percy Hart not too many years ago when Albert Atlas was here, a tour of the Detroit Police Department, and I'd seen some of these things with my dad before. Went through the homicide section, just absolutely scared me to death. Went through the morgue and took a look at what happens to a person when you cock that gun and you point it and pull the trigger and blow their insides away. I don't want my kid to have that value. I don't want that to be a part of their lives. Not only is it contrary to God's law, it also establishes something in their minds that I don't ever want established. And there are a lot of toys that are built on that principle and around that principle. And I think there needs to be some influence as parents toward those things and a curbing of those interests. And like with Brucey, he's the most fascinated by him. It's a constant kind of, no shooting. You can't play that game. People get hurt. Mommies and daddies get killed in war, and little children are left like the pictures in the paper of the kids in Cambodia, wandering around at his age by themselves, fending for themselves because of guns and people shooting at each other with them and what they do to their lives. So some of those things need to be done. All right, there is the aspect as well that needs to be tied to love and time that is, from God's point of view, discipline or correction. Spanking, corporal punishment, highly frowned upon. In fact, they're thinking about passing laws in various states to absolutely make it against the law for you to correct your child and to spank your child. You realize that that's being considered in some states in this country? That it's actually being considered by legislators and state houses to put you in jail for spanking your child. Well, that's going to put us totally contrary to what's in the Bible, and I hope that it doesn't happen within the time that my children are young enough. I hope it never happens. But while they're at an age where I have a chance to at least correct them, because then I'll tell you, we would really have a problem, and we have enough of it going on from a physical abuse point of view. The Bible does not teach in corporal punishment or physical discipline or correction beating of a child. There isn't anywhere that the Bible teaches that. Now, the King James words and the way they're translated, it says, you shall beat your son with a rod. Well, it's not talking about a baseball bat. It's talking about a switch. And any of you that have ever been spanked by them, especially those of you that went out and cut your own, and I've talked to many of you who have, it's like me sending David for the paddle. He knows what that's going to feel like. And when you had to go down, I remember talking to one lady who used to be judged by the size of the switch she chose. She knew if she went down to the willow tree and didn't get one that was big enough, she'd be in more trouble and would have to go back. But she didn't want to get it too big because it would hurt too much. And so there was a little bit of judgment and discretion that had to be used in accomplishing what was there. One of the things that correction does is that it provides the means for you to control your children. Or let me put it another way. I shouldn't say it that way because that's the wrong way to say it. What it provides is a way for your children not to control you. And that's a problem that exists within the discipline of many marriage relationships as far as their children are concerned. You have to be in a position of giving time, not of providing it on demand. That means that you also have to be in a position of not allowing your children to control your life. I've seen it happen where I'm standing talking in a conversation with somebody, with an individual, be it man or woman, and his kids are constantly interrupting. Just constantly walking up and banging them and standing them and kicking them and wandering and going here and there, and they have to stop. And now everybody has to do it periodically. I have to do it. I'll be in the midst of a conversation with you, and I'll see my kid do something, and I'll say, excuse me, and then yell all the way across the auditorium. Because I can see what they're doing. Everybody has to do that periodically, and that's not what I mean. But I mean to the point where it's just plain distraction, where the kid is constantly there pulling and tugging and do this and do that. And I realize that there is no discipline at all that is effective as far as that child is concerned, and the child does not know how to respond to his parent in a proper way. Now, what the purpose that's involved in discipline is concerned is defined for us here in Proverbs 22 and verse 6. It says, train up, in my translation, or educate, which is what the word means, a child in the way that he should go. And when he is old, he is not going to depart from it, or he will not depart from it. Within that framework, we are all involved in a process of education with our children. One of the processes of education is physically disciplining and correcting a child so that he learns that there is a relationship between cause and effect. What's involved as far as children are concerned themselves in correcting them is not a means of what you would call controlling a child. It's a means of teaching him wisdom and teaching that there is a relationship between what he does and what will happen to him. Turn back with me to Proverbs 13 and verse 24. Proverbs 13 and verse 24. He says, he who spares the rod hates his son, because he doesn't teach him what it is that he's done and what it will produce. If a child does something wrong and incorrect, you don't punish the child just because he has done something wrong, but what you do is punish him to make him understand that doing the wrong will bring about punishment, whether it's done by you at the time or whether it's done in some other way by someone else. The examples that are involved in that are myriad, certainly, and I remember, all of the ones that were involved in Ted Armstrong when he wrote the book on child rearing many years ago. He said when you yell stop to your child and he's headed for the street, you want to be the one to correct him, not the car that's going down the road that he doesn't see. Because if the car corrects him, he's not going to have a chance to do it over again in all likelihood. Well, such is the case in the whole structure of correction from a corporal or a physical point of view, from spanking. It's to teach the relationship between cause and effect, to teach wisdom. That if you do this, the result is going to be bad. And as a parent, you're responsible to establish that set of values within your child's mind. It says, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. In other words, with effort. And watches very carefully what it is that is being done, and that rod is applied to do so. Now the question comes up, and always does, when should you start spanking a child? When is it you should begin? Well, I'll tell you what we did. And I've thought about it and watched it afterwards, and I've modified my approach in a variety of ways, and I'm trying my best not to spoil the youngest son that I have, because that could be just as bad as not doing it in a right way. We began, I think, working with and correcting from a physical point of view. David, at the stage that he had reached where you were certain as a parent that he understood the words that you were saying, first of all. That you knew that the child understood what it was you wanted and what it was he was capable of doing. From that point on, which as I sit back and try and remember, was about the stage that he started to kick and toddle around, 12 months, 14 months, somewhere around that age. And when I started spanking him then, when I knew that he understood and he was doing what he wanted to do rather than what he should do, then we began spanking him using fingers. You know, you'd spank him and you don't even have to hit him. We wouldn't even hit him that hard. Just the fact that he'd look at you and bang, big tears rolling down everywhere. Good grief, the kid is going to die. And, you know, all of this stuff was coming out, and you thought, oh, my word. Then he got a little bit older, he got a little bit tougher to handle. And we changed to a paint paddle. You know, you've seen these little paint paddles that are about an inch wide and 3/8 of an inch thick, and you stir paint with them, you know, paint stirrer. He got to be probably about 18 months or so, and he got to use that, and the whole point of that was not that it was hard, but that it would sting. You know, you get a little bit of that nice, cute little round spot in the back there, you know, and bend him over and ping. And boy, that would be all it would take, you know, one stroke of the old paddle would do it. Now, I watched people in the church, literally, I would consider beat their children. Literally. I have seen kids whose rear ends were so calloused, it was just absolutely unbelievable to me. And I also saw the kid. And the response in the kid was just as bad as his rear end was. It was just really bad. I mean, sour. And it was almost impossible after a while to correct the child because he'd become so calloused and so inured to being spanked. And I'd say that it was just way over on the extreme end of how things ought to be done. Now, at this stage, all of our kids are old enough, and we changed a little while later. On our way to the feast one year, we were going to the Dells out of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and we stopped to eat breakfast just after we'd packed up the car and left the house. You know, we stopped to eat breakfast at a little Dutch pantry. And that's where it was. It was a Dutch pantry, I think, and bought one of these paddles that they had, decorative ones on the walls, you know, and it was about 3/4 of an inch thick and about 2.5 or 3 inches wide and, you know, long. And I've forgotten what it had on it. It said for stubborn women and wild kids or horses. What was it? Something like that. My wife said that I bought it for her, and I told her that I didn't marry a horse, so it didn't really apply. In any event, that became then David's feast present. That was one of the first feast presents that he got when he was about 3.5 or 4 years old. And he carried it. In fact, we put it in his bag, and so he carried it along with him at that time. Now, that paddle lasted until it finally cracked once. It just gave up by old age. Probably about 3 or 4 years later. It had gone through David a little while, and it had gone through Becky a little while, and we had to look for a long time to find another one. We have one that's comparable to that now, which we use with the kids. But that paddle accomplishes two things. One, you don't want to hit a child with your hand, not when he gets older, for several reasons. Sometimes you have nothing else, and that's what you have to do. But the possibility of doing damage to a child, hitting him with your hand, or doing damage to yourself hitting him with your hand, is very likely. And it's dangerous. It's more dangerous than using the appropriate style instrument of one kind or another. Now, I don't happen to have a green willow switch that I can go out and get any time that I want it. And they tend to create more problems than they're really worth. But you need to find something that's appropriate to use and then begin to apply it. I don't think there has come a time in all the years that David has done things that I have corrected him for, or Becky either, that I've had to use that paddle on their rear end and spank them more than 3 or 4 or 5 times, to make them understand and to feel what's there. Sometimes you can see within a child while you're correcting them that their will becomes set against you. In other words, there is going to be an attitude of rebellion against you regardless of what happens. And you need to work on that attitude. Correction is to teach wisdom and to provide instruction and education, and it needs to be based on that principle and from that point of view. And when it reaches that stage where I see that and the attitude does not clear up afterwards when you sit down to talk about it and you provide them the time and the love and the instruction that is a part of correction. Correcting a child is not just spanking him on the backside and then saying that's all and letting him walk away. If you do that to a child, then I'd say you have damaged the child. You haven't helped them at all. All you've done is damage him. Unless you take that child then and spend the time to tell them what they did and make sure they understand why they were corrected, and then hold on to them to make sure the child understands that you still love them and still care for them, and erase in their mind anything that's done. I make it a point to tell my children after they've been corrected that it's over, that it's done, that I forgive them and that I don't want to think about it anymore and I don't want them to, that it's finished and that it's all done. Unless the child is taught in that framework and that's a part of the correction, then you are beating your child. You're not correcting them. You're not disciplining them. All you're doing is hitting them. Because a child will not oftentimes be able to understand why it is they have to be corrected, they have to be spanked. Proverbs, the 13th chapter, and in verse 15. No, let's pass on that one and go on to the next one because I don't want to go into that aspect of it right now. Proverbs 23 and verse 13. Proverbs 23:13. It says, "Do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you beat him with the rod, he will not die." Now, there are certain aspects of things that need to be taught and certain disciplines that need to be provided with a child as well. And as a parent, when you correct a child, you ought to be correcting according to what has been done wrong. There are certain things that my children know that I will correct them for much more severely than I will correct them for other things. I will correct them very rapidly and very sternly if I find out that they have lied. If I find out that they have done something that is wrong and they do not tell me or they lie to me about it, then the correction is going to be much more severe. And they're aware of that. And they begin to understand that it's a whole lot better to tell the truth because the correction that's involved in doing it then is a lot less. And oftentimes it's not any at all. Sometimes the discipline that comes from what they've done themselves. You have a child that reaches up and decides, for an extreme example, to touch the stove. Well, he's burned. You don't need to correct him anymore. In fact, he's got the correction. He has the consequence. What you need to provide is the instruction and the love and the time that goes with it afterwards. The point that's involved, though, from what's here is that you must discipline a child. And when you do, he won't die. He may be awfully upset about it afterwards. I remember my oldest brother, one of my older brothers, in the situation. He came home one night, 3 o'clock in the morning, was supposed to be home at about midnight. He was 16 or 17 and a hero of mine because at the time I was only 10. So, you got a brother who drives and was popular with all the kids. He came home with my dad's car at 3 o'clock in the morning. My dad met him at the door, asked him if he knew what time it was, to which my brother, who had been drinking, which was not a good idea, driving my dad's car, answered, yes, he did. And my dad said, weren't you supposed to be home a little earlier? He said, yes, I was, but at which time my dad cold-cocked him and laid him right out on the floor. One shot, right straight to the jaw, and there he was, prone. The whole house was upset. I was up and watched it happen. Scared me to death. Absolutely scared me to death. And I determined right then and there when I watched him hit the deck that I was never going to be in a position to have my dad do that to me. I liked my dad. I also liked my brother, but I determined of the two it was smarter to like my dad after I watched that happen. Now, some of those things that are seen by example also carry on in your own family. If you have teenagers who are in your home, and at the same time you've got a kid that's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years old, if you don't make those teenagers understand that how they respond, how they act, and what they say, they're going to end up being corrected for much more severely because of the example they set to the younger kids, then you're going to have yourself a problem with those younger kids because they're going to watch what you do and how those teenagers respond to what is said and done. Now, I'm not advocating that you cold cock your 16-year-old teenager on the floor in the kitchen. On the other hand, I'm not advocating that you don't if that's the way he needs to be corrected. I've seen it happen. And I've seen a lot of kids, it's too bad it didn't happen to. The dear old dad just didn't lay them out on the floor once and make them pay attention. And understand that albeit they're 16 or 17 years old, they have not yet reached a point where they can't be paddled. I don't advocate it, believe me. But on the other hand, there are times when I don't see that there's any other thing that can be done other than just turning the kid loose and letting him go, which is a tragedy all by itself. Sometimes a correction is a lot better coming from a parent in a situation like that than it is from anybody else, if the circumstance warrants it and it comes to the point where that has to be done. Proverbs 23 here in verse 14, it says, "You will beat him with a rod, and you will deliver his soul from hell," from Sheol or from the grave. Now, it's the same thing that I would say, that you have to teach the relationship that exists between cause and effect. And what you're actually doing is that you are building a standard of value within your children. You're building a standard of right and wrong. And you are establishing that pattern within their lives. And that's exactly what God does with us. He builds a standard within us, a framework of right and wrong, of character. We're doing it from a spiritual point of view. With our children, hopefully, it's from a physical point of view. Proverbs the 19th chapter and in verse 18. Let's take a look at one other, and then I'll just list the other one for you. You can turn and look at it later on. Proverbs 19 and verse 18. It says, "Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death." There comes a period of time when there is no more hope. I mean, there comes a period of time when the only way the child will learn is by hard knocks. The college of hard knocks, as it used to be called when I was a kid. And if that's the way the kid decides to go, then that's the way he's going to learn. Some of us went through that college, and some of our children will, as a result, go through it too. If they do, then that's fine. But the point is, there is a period of time when hope stops, when you can no longer effectively discipline or correct a child. And you want to do it as a parent long before that time comes and passes again. I want to take a look at Proverbs 29, verses 15 and 17 as well, later on when you get a chance. One other thing that has to be mentioned again, and I want to reiterate it for the sake of the mothers that are present, and that is that you do not reason with the child, and that you learn to be consistent with the child in correction. And that you also learn to discipline yourself to speak to your child only once when you want something done. Only once is all that's necessary if the child hears you. What will happen if you don't is that the child will learn what your tolerance level is. He will learn whether you will say it 2 or 3 times and then he has to go do it because he knows he's in trouble. And so he'll back up one short of when he knows you'll finally run out of time and will do it then. And as a parent, when you're dealing with children, you ought to learn and you ought to teach your children. I want to tell you once to do this, and that's all. Now, isn't it terrible when it happens? You speak to the child, and you're pretty sure he heard you, but he doesn't do it. It's hard, because what you want to do normally, rationally, is say it again to give him another chance. But what you end up doing is saying it over and over again in a multitude of circumstances. And you do not provide the right kind of atmosphere for a child to function in. And the simplest thing to do to teach a child that is to tell them, now look, Johnny, from now on I'm going to say what I have to say to you once, and I expect you to respond. And if he doesn't respond, don't say it again. Don't yell, don't raise your voice, you don't have to do anything else. You go find the paddle and pick it up and say, Johnny, bend over. Pow. Now, Johnny, I'm going to tell you again. I'm only going to speak once. And I'll tell you what, through the course of one day, you will teach that child to respond when you speak to him one time. If you're consistent in what you do, and you stop trying to reason or play games with a child. Now, it's a problem basically of women. Usually there, as I say, I think it's because they're used to talking to the kids all day long. And so in the course of conversation, telling them to do something is, just like any of a multitude of other things that went on during the course of the day. But it drags on to the point where the kid is controlling your time, rather than you directing his time. And that's something that cannot be allowed to exist within the functioning of a family itself, and especially if there's 3 or 4 or 5 children. Then you're just going to go bananas. I mean, you'll go absolutely crazy with those kids if they don't hear and listen and you don't apply the principle. As I say, it's primarily an area that deals with mothers, but it's also true with fathers. Usually it's not so much of a problem with them because they don't have the kind of patience to put up with it. And you don't want, in a situation like that, to revert either to yelling. Don't raise your voice, or push it louder, or say it louder, or more distinctly. Just get the paddle and apply it, and after a period of doing it, they'll learn, if you'll do it, to respond that way. A couple of other areas that are involved here as far as the basic principles of child rearing. One is do not go to extremes as a parent. And we have that framework within the church as well. We have mothers and fathers here who don't think their kids could ever do anything wrong. My kid is just perfect. Then we have parents, on the other hand, who have their children so cowed and who are so afraid that they do not even know how to express a lot of times the needs and the feelings and the desires that they have, because they're afraid of walking into a paddle constantly if they do. Try to avoid the extremes that are there, and as a husband and wife, learn to balance out what that relationship ought to be and how it ought to be handled within dealing with the children themselves. One other area that has to be built up within children and has to be done by parents is that of building a proper feeling of worth within the child's mind and of value. It can't only be a matter of correction. It must also be a matter within you as a parent of looking for the talents, the abilities, the skills that your children have, and then developing those skills. Working on encouraging them and building them. Working on learning how to praise your child. How to tell them when they've done something that is good and worthwhile. Today, before we left for church, I asked Brucey to clean up the family room because there were pillows all over the place on the floor and all the blankets that were there. It's a very simple thing. And I told him before I went upstairs to get dressed, I said, Brucey, pick up all the blankets and the pillows and put them on the couch. Now, Brucey's 4, and you don't expect him to do a whole lot. I figured that he'd just pick them up and throw them up on the couch, and I was going to be glad of that because then I wouldn't have to walk over them. But I went upstairs and came back downstairs, and Brucey had tried as best he could to fold the blankets. Now, at 4 years old, you don't do real good when the blankets are bigger than you are, by several sizes around. But he had tried to fold the blankets and stack them all up and stuff them up on a corner. Now, when he came back that I saw him again, I told him, hey, Bruce, you did a good job of stacking up the blankets, putting the pillows away. Now, it doesn't mean a thing. It means absolutely nothing to me. But, I know what it means to him. It causes him to feel that he did something that in my eyes was worthwhile. And to him, I reflect God. Not only because I'm bigger than he is, but because everything that's involved in his life is dependent upon me. Same thing is true with you as a mother toward your child. Everything that child sees is dependent upon you. And if you never ever open your mouth in encouragement, in praise, in appreciation, in telling the value and the worth of what has been done as far as that child is concerned, then you are going to leave that child in a state with a very low sense of self-esteem, a very low sense of worth, and a constant hearing in his ear of do this, do that, not this, not that, but never anything that causes the child to see its own value and its own worth. And as parents, you need to work on making certain that that is done, that it is not left out in terms of what is done in child rearing itself. One other thing that has to be done too, and one other principle that has to be worked on from the very beginning of your child rearing, from the very beginning of the time the child can understand what you're doing, is working on that child's sense of independence and responsibility. Working on building within that child the concept of mind that he's going to reach an age where he's going to be on his own, where he's going to be independent and out functioning on his own. And as parents, you need to work with children to teach them that. Now, that's hard to do. I remember not so long ago when we bought David his bike. Bought a 10-speed. And I use David as examples because, he's the oldest one and it happens there. And inevitably, the first summer that he had the thing, he didn't realize what he had. Kid's got a 10-speed bike, that rascal will cover a lot of ground in a very short period of time. You can go from here to there, hither to yon, and nothing flat. Well, last year he didn't quite realize, first year he had it last time, didn't quite realize what that thing was. And Amy's great fear was that sooner or later he would. And then when he did, he was going to want to go. Go where? Well, wasn't quite sure where. But the point is, now we live about 2.5 miles from the center of town. And it means crossing Sheldon Road, it means crossing Ann Arbor Road, Ann Arbor Trail, Main Street, and a multitude of places up into town. Well, it's come to the point now where it suddenly dawned on David that his favorite hobby shop is in downtown Plymouth. Downtown Plymouth is not all that far away. And as a family, we would ride our bikes from where our home was in the summertime in the mornings. When the kids were out of school, we'd get on the bikes and ride up to the post office to pick up the mail, where my post office box is, and then ride back home again. When they were little, we'd ride them on the back of our bikes. Well, now he's ridden up there back and forth last summer a couple times on his bike with us, and he knows the way. And so the next question was, can I go? And then you see that white expression appear upon your wife's face as all the blood drains. My baby, my kid, all by himself, on that bike, from here to there, going over all those streets. And the fear is the first thing that happens. And then when you answer the question and the boy asks and you say, okay, Dave, go ahead and go. Then the gasp of, oh no! She didn't say it, didn't say a thing. Allowed it all to happen and to take place, and now he rides back and forth up to town, and his mind is venturing now into other areas, I'm certain. By that stage it'll be next summer, and we'll have to worry about that wherever it happens to be. But the point is this, that one of the most difficult things to do for a parent is to let go of a child. To allow the child to become independently functioning as an entity, as an individual on his own. You know, that's God's whole purpose in what He's doing with us as a father. His whole purpose is that He does not want us to be automatons. He wants us to have within ourselves, within our own individuality, within our own personality, within our own character, having proved to Him over the life we've lived that by the time we're born, we've accepted His values. We've made them a part of what we are, and He can make us rulers with the power that He has, with the life that He has, knowing that we will keep the same values, that we will adhere to the same standards that He's taught us throughout the period of time that we're becoming part of His family. Now, that same thing is true with us as parents with our children. And you have to encourage that area of independence and responsibility in a child as soon as you possibly can, and make it start to build toward that period of time when that child goes off on his own. And there are multitudes of ways that you can do it. Teaching them jobs around the house and having them do it, allowing them to go and run errands for you. Now it's quite convenient that David can ride his bike and can go at the speed that he can go, because Amy can say, here's $2, go up to the store, get a gallon of milk, and come back. And you don't have to get in the car and drive there and go, or you don't have to walk. All of a sudden you got Hot Wheels here who's willing to ride up there and back. Because in the meantime, he can stop off and say hi to his friends, and can stop and look in the store while he's there and wander around, get back on the bike. But the letting go is hard to do. Very difficult to do. But it's something that has to be encouraged and established. With David, for the first time yesterday, although he's had a bank account for years, I took him to the bank. And for the first time yesterday, we went through the procedures of how you put money in and take money out of your savings account. And sat down and showed him what the slips were and write out the form. This is what you do. Today you're putting in some money. Up till this time, I've always done it. But I told him yesterday, we went to the bank and he filled out the form. I gave him the savings book and I said, okay, it's now yours. You take care of it. It's no longer going to be kept in my office downstairs, but you keep it in your room someplace and don't lose it. It's serious business. It's important, but it's a beginning for him now to become financially, to have the wheels start to turn. Open up the book. He's old enough to sign his own name now, ways past. Open up the book and look, this is how much money I've got. This is how much I put in last week. This is when we took the money out to buy my bike, because he had to buy his own bike when he bought it, all but about $40. He kicked in $100, I kicked in $40, and it was his bike. Okay, that's fine. But he had to buy it. He had to earn the money to do it. Well, now he's old enough to keep the book. And those types of things are the kind of things that can be done over and over and over again to allow the child to develop that kind of independence and the responsibility that goes with it. The principles that are involved in child rearing are intended to lead finally to a child becoming an adult and functioning on his own in a way that you as a parent can turn around and look at that child and say, that was at least the best shot at it that I could make. The kid's not going to turn out perfect. I have no delusions about my children. I have no delusions about their activities. I have no delusions about the fact that I know they'll do things wrong, that they'll make mistakes, that they'll make fools out of themselves, that they'll do things incorrectly. But I do have this concept in mind toward my children that to me is more important than anything else. And that is that by the time they get to be that age, of 18 years of age, I want them to have accepted in their mind a certain structure of values that they believe is right, a certain mode of action, of activity, of functioning as far as what I believe is proper and right on their behalf as individuals, and see that myself when they're on their own. That's the desire, the goals, the purpose that's in mind when I finally get them to that point. The principles that we talked about today are principles from God's point of view that work toward that end. And principles as they work toward that end that provide in and of themselves a great deal of satisfaction when you watch the kids develop in those areas. Turn back with me, if you will, here finally to the Psalms. And let's read what it says. as David commented a little bit about it in the 127th Psalm. Behold, he said in Psalm 127 and verse 3, children are a gift of the eternal. The fruit of the womb is a reward from God, because it provides for us the ability to do what God does. Be a father, be a parent, teach values, establish, instruct, help, build, and watch develop life itself. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. You know, as they grow up and are aged with you, something my dad used to get a great deal of enjoyment out of. He'd show up someplace when we were all home and he was still alive and we were all grown. You know, I was 19 years old when my dad died. My younger brother, my baby brother, is 6'7". He's the biggest one in the family. I'm the runt in the family. I'm little under 6 foot, about 5'11". My two older brothers are 6'4" and 6'5", and my dad was about 6'2". And so my dad got no greater delight in anything that he ever did than trooping in someplace with all four of us. It just gave him a certain sense of worth and value and well-being when he marched in there and he was surrounded by all of these monsters and his little runt that was with him. It's where I always was in the family. But nevertheless, it gave him a certain sense of worth. And that's exactly what is being talked about here by David. You know, that when your children grow and you turn around and look at them as they've come to be adults, then it is a reward. He says, how blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. And my dad certainly felt that way. So did I when I needed help. You know, I'd go enlist the whole troop and say, okay, let's go see him. And it provided quite a formidable group when we arrived to discuss the matter again. How blessed, he says in the next Psalm, verse 1, is everyone who fears the eternal and who walks in his ways. When you shall eat the fruit of your own hands, you will be happy and it will be well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants. Not that they're going to give oil or turn into anything of that variety or you're going to eat them, but they're going to be fruitful and produce something of value. Well, for me, I know what the values are I want my children to produce, and I know the principles that God gives that ought to lead them in that way. Behold, for thus shall the man be blessed who fears the eternal. The eternal bless you from Zion, and may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life, and indeed may you see your children's children, and peace upon Israel. May you be able to see not only the fruit of your life, but also the fruit of theirs, and live in a society in which they'll be able to grow and blossom. Well, that's something that we all have the hope of and the desire toward, is that your children will not only live through into the kingdom of God, but their children will grow up within the society that God himself will govern and rule, and that we hopefully will have a part in as well. If his children, we are fruitful. The principles work if you apply them, if you use them, if you learn to function with them. There are a couple of books that are worthwhile in studying and reading where the principles are covered. Ted Armstrong's book, I think you could still read on child rearing if you could find it somewhere. I would say there are certain portions of that I consider way too strict in the application specifically of correction. That's my opinion about it. If you read it, I would read it with a sense of reserve in some of the areas there as far as correction is concerned. There's another book that I recommend to almost every young couple that's going to get married, that I recommend to them to read even though they haven't got any children at the time, and that is a book written by a fellow by the name of Dobson. It's called Dare to Discipline, and goes through the structure and the principles of correction and discipline pretty much from a biblical point of view. Not everything that he's written do I agree with, but for the most part I think it's an excellent book and worthwhile to add to your library if you've got young children to deal with. There's also a whole series of books, some of which I consider valuable and others of which I'm not too sure about, in parent effectiveness training, PET, that many of you I think have read or seen some things about. Some of that material is valuable and is useful. But the principles we talked about today, the principles of God as far as child rearing is concerned, are the most valuable and the most useful ones. The application of those are going to help you a great deal as far as fulfilling what you would like to see from your own children as they develop into adults and function on their own.